Hello and welcome to Canada's History's last webinar in the spring series. This series has revolved around visual history. Since March, we have been hearing from educators, public historians, and graphic designers speaking about their experiences using visuals to share Canadian history, and today is no different. My name is Jessica Knapp, and I am the host for the series, or I have been the host for the series, and I will continue to be for today. Over the next hour, James Gillespie and Nancy Payne will discuss their approach to making history come alive for kids from their work with Kayak, Canada's history magazine for kids. But before we begin today's presentation, I would like to provide you with a quick introduction to Canada's National History Society. Canada's history is dedicated to promoting greater popular interest in Canadian history, principally through publishing, education, and recognition programs. If you are interested in knowing more or subscribing to our flagship publications, Canada's History Magazine and Kayak, Canada's History Magazine for Kids, please click on the links on the screen and save them for later. Those links will not work on YouTube. It will only pause the video if you are watching the recording. If you are working on a Governor General's History Award application for excellence in community programming, it is time to start wrapping it up and getting those last letters of reference in. The deadline for applications is July 15th. That is next Friday, so just a little over a week to complete that. And if you don't know what the Governor General's History Award for Community Programming is, click on the link on the screen and read about it and see if your project is eligible for next year's. To ensure the best experience possible this afternoon, I encourage you to close down any unnecessary programs your computer is currently running. For example, Photoshop. It tends to slow everything down from MySpace. So you have a few minutes to do that before we get started. You're not going to miss anything just yet. However, if there are issues, we are recording today's webinar, as we do with all our webinars, and it will become available on YouTube in the next few days. If you are on social media, I encourage you to spread the word about our conversation today. I have included Canada's History's Twitter handle and Facebook link on the screens. If you have not already liked and follow us, please do. And I know Nancy is also on Twitter. And Nancy, if you want to share your Twitter handle in the chat so people can tweet at you, that'd be awesome. So if you have any questions during today's webinar, you are welcome to ask them at any time, and James and Nancy will answer them as they see fit. If they are directly related to the discussion at hand, I'm sure they will take the time, but don't be insulted if they wait until later, because as I am sure you all know, there is a flow to a presentation, and we like to keep the flow going. So without further ado, a little bit about our presenters today. Nancy has been the editor of Kayak, Canada's History Magazine for Kids, since 2011. Before that, she edited publications for the Canadian Wildlife Federation, including Wild, a nature and environment magazine for young readers. She has also been a producer with CBC Radio in Ottawa and has written for a wide range of Canadian magazines and newspapers. She has a master's in journalism from Carleton University. James Gillespie joined Canada's History in 2009 as a web designer. He became the art director for Kayak in December 2010. In 2013, he became art director of Canada's History Magazine. Since then, James has helped coordinate many award-winning articles and covers for both magazines. He looks forward to sharing some of his expertise in the graphic depiction of Canada's history with you today. I will take a moment and upload their presentation. In the meantime, I welcome James and Nancy to unmute their microphones and join the conversation.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hello, everybody. Great. Well, welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is James Gillespie, the art director for Canada's History Society, and this is our presentation on designing Kayak, from Suffragists to Superheroes, Canadian History for Kids. Is there anything at this point that you'd like to add, Nancy?
Just that our general philosophy, I was thinking about the first time we met James. For those of you who don't know, James is in Winnipeg. I'm in my home office in Central Ontario. And the first time we met, I had the sense that we were both in sync about how we wanted to approach the magazine. So that was a pretty great place to start from. And let's hope that continues today.
Yes, well, we are. We do have a very similar approach. I started out working for Kayak simply because when I came to come to Canada's History, it was designing the broader website for the Society. And at that point, the Society had such depth, I didn't even know that Canada's History even had a kids magazine, which is something that Kayak has been really pushing for in the last 6-7 years, to establish more of a presence nationally, which I think it's done quite a good job doing. But I was excited because I have an illustration background. Aside from being a designer, I love drawing, and so I was a little choked that I'd come in. And fortunately for me, about a year and a half in, the old art director left, and I jumped at the chance to work on this magazine. And so I worked on one issue with the old editor, Jill, and then when that finished, I got to meet Nancy. And right off the bat, it seemed like she had a really good handle on the kind of content that we needed to do, and was very open to working with me as far as some of the graphic approaches and how I feel about interpreting information visually, which is sort of what we're going to dig into now. Is there anything else, Nancy?
I think we are fundamentally in sync on the question of, I keep coming back to this idea that something like Kayak can't feel like it's good for readers, or they won't read it. I mean, probably many of you are involved in education in some way. So we work to make it, I think it's fair to say, as engaging as possible, so that the learning happens kind of by accident as kids are delving into these stories about people and places and events, and the design is absolutely crucial to making that happen, which is why we're so lucky to have James.
Yeah, I try to think of trying to make it like candy, you know what I mean? Is just very palatable for people. And for myself, it's also one of the things that I really enjoy is I'm a highly visual person, so outside of the content applying to younger people, it is also something that it's how I learn, so I put a lot of myself and how I would absorb information is kind of how I come along with the visual approach. I'm just going to flip over to the next slide here so we can start this out. So our goal is to tell stories in interesting ways. We really strive to do that, and there's a lot of work that goes into it, which mainly starts with Nancy and her acquisition of information. What you'll see here in front of you are a variety of covers that we've come out with in the last couple of years, and you can see that the covers are all very vibrant, but they all have slightly different styles to them, and obviously broader themes that we'll discuss later. But it's just what goes into it is a fair amount of work, and the work flow as it goes is that there's a lot more structure. I am not the end of the line person who says exactly how all of this art happens. There's a variety of people, actually. Since I took over the art direction of Canada's History magazine, we had to bring on another designer to help with the workload, because although Kayak is half the size of Canada's History magazine, because it is so dense visually with so many different fonts and images, illustrations, and design elements, it can take just as long to do a half-size magazine as it does to take, as it would take me to do a full-size. So we brought on a designer, Lee McKenzie, who's exceptionally talented, and does the lion's share of the production work now. But outside of my work with Lee, I also work hand in hand with Nancy a lot of the time, a lot of phone conversations and discussions in regards to clarifying facts, information, and other things. And we also have a publisher named Melanie Ward, who also has feedback into the broader sense of sales and trying to push the magazine and grow it as I suppose, a property or an entity. Nancy, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Maybe I'll just mention that I'd hate to make it sound like we have a cast of thousands. Everybody who works on this is part-time. Most of you are probably aware Kayak's published 4 times a year. So I do other projects, Lee does other projects, James, as you've heard, does other projects. And we're all in different locations. So it's a very modern way of kind of dealing with things at a distance, but I think it works fairly well. But why don't we start maybe taking you through kind of how the process works through one issue?
Sure.
So maybe we can go to the next slide.
Absolutely. All right. Well, you know what, Nancy? I'm going to let you take this one because really the selection of theme is your bread and butter. So.
Sure, that makes sense. As I say, 4 issues a year, and we try to mix it up between quote unquote heavier issues. So that might be something like the Constitution or recently women getting the right to vote. We mix those up with issues on food, on Canadian comics. I'm starting to research one on Canadian humor for the fall, for December actually. So we really think it's important to include cultural history, social history, and as wide a range of voices as we possibly can. So it starts with, I guess really me. I try to work a couple of years out coming up with this broad overarching range of themes, and then fill in each one. It usually starts with something I've been reading about and I'm thinking, that's cool. There's enough there to sustain a whole issue. So doing the preliminary research, coming up with a lineup that includes, and again, if you're familiar with the magazine, you'll know that we have feature items. We have a fiction story, a comic, something called Backyard History, which is places kids can go to visit to learn more about that issue's theme, games and puzzles, and a variety of things so that we can tell those stories in different ways. And then when I come up with that lineup, it's sent to, I have a panel of 3 advisors, either who sit on the board of Canada's history or who are academic advisors. And I kind of think of this as all the stuff that's below the surface of the iceberg, which is kind of what you see if you get an issue of Kayak. They review the content for historical accuracy, for sensitivities. We're just putting the finishing touches on an issue about pioneers, as we used to call them, or settlers. And that really helped to have a lot of different viewpoints, putting their perspective into that as well. So then, once I've got that together, research the stories, I send the stories off to the designer, Lee McKenzie, and to James, and then we have a meeting to start talking about how this might actually look. So those 3 on the left there, those are just a sample of 3 themes we've done over the last 5 years, and then we can kind of broaden it out into all the different types of treatments we have for stories. So that's sort of the start of the process. There's a lot that goes into even before we can talk about visuals, but I completely recognize that I'm totally guilty of being very focused on words and themes, and that's why it's so cool to have teammates who know so much more than I do about graphic design.
Yeah. Before we continue into the rest of the slides, basically what happens at the beginning visually is Nancy will come up with an outline, and she's constantly working to create a variety of departments and features. So they're going to come in at different times and places throughout the production process, which runs generally about 8 weeks. But as you can see here, starting off visually, one of the most powerful tools that we use throughout this piece is our fonts and the typefaces that we choose. And one of the main differences between Canada's History magazine magazine and Kayak magazine is that I, for Canada's History magazine, often have a very set group of fonts, and I may have a variance of them that I'll alternate through, but they generally stay the same so that there's this real sense of consistency. Kayak has a tendency to break that mold, and we're very liberal with the fonts that we end up using. And you can see why, is because when we get to these certain themes, to make them as fun as we possibly can, we can really alter that. So in the case of Vikings, you can see there that we've gone with a font that has that sort of carved wood, you know, old style feel that brings that to light. For Titanic, we chose a font that was very strong and powerful and tall and just gave you that sense that, so when that's overlaid over top of the image, in this case these would be the cover images, that there's just that reinforcement, that there's a unity between the type that we're using and the images and the selection of the artists and whatnot. And that all comes down to when we've got that, that sort of starts in the theme piece. You know, we talk, we get a feel. Is this going to be big? Is it going to be elegant? Is it going to be old-timey, you know? And we discuss through what's coming up in more of a bullet point style fashion. And then as the process begins, we start to get the features and other such pieces rolling in, and we can kind of have larger conversations of what we intend to do. So I'm going to move on to the next slide, which is more variety means more appeal. So throughout the magazine, we have a variety of departments that we deal with. Each magazine will have a series of features, but we have some very consistent parts of the magazine that are always there in repetition. And here are some examples of them. We have up top is our You Otter Know section, which is like an introduction to the piece where we developed these ambassador characters, Tika and Bo, who are these river otters who can embody the themes themselves. In this case, we have them inside, I guess this is the Prime Minister's issue. And so they're not dressed, they're more of in a contemporary environment, but you know, we can have them dressed up as voyageurs, or we can have them dressed up in World War I regalia, anything like that. And then one of the other sections that we have is the History Mystery, which is a section where we choose you know, a specific aspect of history. We create various explanations and describe different parts of it to people, but one is always incorrect, and it's up to the reader to choose or try and figure out which one is. This is one that was on Sir Sam Hughes, which is some of my favorite art by one of the artists we do named Mathieu Beaulieu from Montreal, and I thought he did a really exceptional job with this one. Then we have the You Think You Have It Tough, which is a comparison piece. This is from our theater issue, and explains comparison between past events and big events. And then we have our comic, which we'll be discussing in depth later. And this is from the theater one as well. It's one of my favorite pieces that we did about Cirque du Soleil. And Nancy, is there anything that you'd like to contribute to this that I'm missing out on from your perspective?
No, more just from the sense that we do use a variety of formats in order to, you know, we have a fiction feature which is more text, and that's not for every kid. So we generally gravitate to these more bite-sized pieces of information, which is not news to anybody who's joining us today, I'm sure. My kids are now out of the Kayak age range, but, you know, and having read lots of stuff that they read, I got a feel for what might appeal to kids that age. I am not an educator, not a historian. We're just looking for something that appeals to kids. And we figure that these little bits and pieces are probably the best way to do it. And again, you see that reflected in all kinds of areas. Several of you are with museums. So in all kinds of texts for kids, I think this is the direction things go. But we figure the more we offer, the more we're likely to have something in there that will appeal to most kids. But how we get things to the point where they look accurate is a really big part of what we do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right.
And the part about visual accuracy is definitely, well, like if we move to the next slide, that's what we spend a lot of time focusing on, because we can't just kind of turn illustrators loose to do stuff. It's not fair to them. And I'm amazed at how long it takes me to research visual material. So it might be something as simple as a little illustration that's going in the side of a piece, and you need to research clothes, you need to research the general look of people at that time, you need to research the background, what kind of buildings did they live in, if they're sitting around a table, what kind of table would it be, what kind of dishes would they have, what kind of food would they eat. It takes a long time. It's kind of fun, but it can also you end up going down these rabbit holes and pulling out and going, okay, maybe the exact colors in that particular kind of beadwork aren't crucial right now. But I know, James, maybe I'll turn it over to you. You and Lee do so much research to get correct photographs as well, right?
That's absolutely true. But it's not something that we can do without you. It is really a huge collaboration between editorial, and we've talked about this in the past, where early when you were writing, you were doing a fair amount of research, but I found that since we've started working together and we've had so many years, that the list of links, what I find particularly helpful is because when you're writing something like this, so much research goes into it, and the thought of, I think probably maybe working with the comic is probably the thing that, or the fiction features as well, reinforce this the most, is this idea when you're writing a story that you don't, you can generally say like, oh, they were by the barn or something like that, you know? And then we as the artists will look at that and go, what kind of barn and from what era, and then we have to go down that rabbit hole because we're trying to give the most accurate sense of what we've done. A case in point from that is we did a piece on the Northwest Mounted Police a number of years ago, and the artist got a bunch of stuff wrong on it, you know, and we'd sent all this reference and explained that, you know, what their collars look like, what their cuffs look like, and he ended up drawing the Northwest Mounted Police officer's jacket as though he were like a pirate from the 16th or from the 17th century, and we had to correct that. So it's super important that and helpful that what Nancy will do is she goes through, and when she's researching it for herself, she'll leave links that take us to the same places that she's gone. And that's just an efficiency thing. It's very, you can't expect someone, a designer or an illustrator, to go and do the exact same amount of research and end up in the same places, you know? But if you're willing to just go, hey, I ended up here, and I ended up here, and here's this picture, then suddenly we can start weaving through that and add to that level of information and research, and go through. So, for instance, here, you know, what did Thanadelthur? Did I say that correctly? I don't think I pronounced that right.
I don't think we know, to be perfectly honest. It was a pretty long time ago.
That's okay. Well, anyways, I'm not going to make another attempt at it. But as you can see here, sort of an example of what we do. We live in a digital age, so really our first approach is generally to hit Google. We go there, and it's an amazing resource that opened up. And actually funny, because this is a later piece here, so you'll see a whole bunch of stuff, but you actually see our comic, bottom left, second row from the bottom. Is there too now as a reference to her. But as we went through, the one thing that was helpful is that we found through our association with the HBC History Archives that there was a painting of someone who had drawn her. So, I mean, we provide all of this to the comic book artist, and we really trust that we've hired the right guy, which we have. His name's Alex Deocean, and he just slugs away. But, you know, we really do our best to try and get a sense of what costume looks like and to keep things as accurate as we possibly can. And that applies, the approach similar to this applies to almost everything we do. And it can be lengthy, you know. Sometimes you don't find what you want right away, and you are kind of stuck. And so thank goodness that we have the amount of time that we do to produce the magazine, because it is very rarely the case that you just find exactly what you're looking for and click and download it. You know, in a lot of cases, we have to hire illustrators to visually interpret this work for us, or do it ourselves. You know, either I'm illustrating, or Lee herself is often creating graphics or illustrations to pad out the magazine. So I'll continue to the next slide now. And this is, for myself, really one of the most important aspects of the magazine, which is who we choose to visually interpret our work and finding the right illustrator. We have discussions about this right at the point of the outline arriving. We all often talk and strategize about, you know, how we want the magazine to feel, how it might flow, what's coming in, and what articles and what departments and other features are going to come in what way. And we always sit down and start lists of who we want to work with us. And at this point, we have a very staple talent base that we use. So we know, for instance, you'll see 4 of the options who we use here, which is Stéphane Butin, who's done a number of covers for us, an exceptionally talented illustrator, who we use because he can really do cartoony, or he can do painterly, or he can do semi-cartoony. I'll actually click back to our covers here, and you'll see here the Meet Our Prime Ministers and the Vikings are both done by, and the 10 out of 10 are all Stéphane. We use him because he can really vary his style. You can see a little bit of it there, but on the Vikings, he's more painterly. He's got a little bit more line work with the Prime Ministers, and then he's got the very, very cartoony and exciting piece with the 10 out of 10. So how we usually go about this is I use a variety of programs. Behance from Adobe being one of them, which is a program where you can go in and all of these artists. I have to double check on Taryn Gee, but all the other artists in this on this page are Canadian, and I really strive to make sure that we're often hiring Canadian illustrators. Not that hiring someone from the States or the UK isn't all right, but I've found in the past that there is this almost pride that the artists take in their work, and they just have an intuitive understanding of what we're trying to achieve generally, and we very rarely run into problems. Is there anything that you'd like to add, Nancy?
Just that this part feels like magic to me because, as I mentioned before, I'm a words person, and seeing the choices of illustrators and what they can do with the material you provide to them is just amazing to see how they complement each other. So this is a very exciting part of the process, actually, for me.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's exciting for me too, what I love, and specifically why I chose to show these images, which have no relation to what we do in Kayak, is simply the fact that this is sort of the, as an art director, this is what I do. I am presented with generally a script or a story that I read through, and what I have to do is I go and I'll find them. There's lots of artists. It's a lot easier now because now that I'm established as the art director of Kayak, I'm constantly sent work from illustrators. But when I started, it was this process of really looking at what an artist's style is like, and then visualizing whether or not the way that they're drawing will apply to something historic, you know? And for me, I made a decision very early on that I was going to approach generally people who had more of a comic booky style and whose work would fit probably within the realm of like video games, because that's what most kids consume when they're young, and to be confronted with a topic that they may be unfamiliar with or they may not have interest in right away, if we can engage them using sort of a visual vernacular that they're used to seeing in other environments, then they engage and will accept it, you know, or even look at it where they otherwise may have not an interest in it. And we really do try to balance that out too, between a balance between cartoony and maybe masculine, and having some more feminine style of artwork as well. You know, not necessarily in color palette, but I think that it appeals across the board to a lot of people, you know. But we realize that we don't just have boys reading Kayak, and we don't just have girls, so we really try to balance it as best we can. Yeah, and that's it. So once I've found someone who I feel's work might work well with us, I approach them, and we, you know, haggle and get a contract going, and they come in. And to tell you the truth, we've really worked with some very talented artists who you provide them with the research, but they just are so passionate as illustrators. They're just curious human beings that they go and they do a lot of research themselves, and they come back. And I have to admit, from my level, Nancy has often done way more research than me, so I do rely on her quite strongly to correct small things like costume or environment, or finer point things that she's read about for a long time before creating the content that she provides to us. So
or my personal favorite last year when we were... Sorry, James, I was just going to say one of my personal favorites was last year. I grew up on a farm, and the illustrator did a really nice illustration for our fiction piece about the Battle of Seven Oaks, and from like the I think the piece was set afterwards, so in the 1820s. And it wasn't until the second go through that I looked at the illustration and realized the kid was leaning up against a round bale on a farm. And anybody who grew up on a farm knows that round bales are a pretty recent invention. And we caught that and went with a pile of loose hay instead, which was far more authentic. So, yeah. So anyway, just moving on to
that's similar
the next
to the yeah. You caught that again the last time when I believe in our War of 1812 issue, where they didn't use the right kind of cow. Maybe they chosen a Jersey. We ended up changing to a different kind of cow. So choosing the right look. So one of the next points in the stage of things to do is we start applying looks and ideas and working out photos and just the general theme of some of our features. In this case, this was from our, I'm trying to think, is this our Rebellion one, Nancy?
No, I think this is, oh yeah, it is. I was thinking it was our Loudmouths, but right. Yeah, I think this is the idea of rebellion and resistance and expressing opposition to stuff.
Yeah. So as you can see, sometimes we use old templates from previous issues, which is why I was confused, because we have the Canadian maple leaf down in the folios there. But these, you can see that Lee, who designs this, will come up, and she will sort of just start throwing down ideas. And what we decided in this is, since this was on standing up, sounding off, protesting, and being activists, that we would try and work signs into this. So we went and we found some graphic images of a hand holding a sign, and we started trying to work it out. And we just realized while this was happening, upon review, that we'd gone with a visual reinforcement of all the signs in the back there, so it looked like, you know, there was a huge protest going, and then we'd have more signs in the front, and then we realized with the amount of images, the amount of text, that we were just overwhelming. You know, it really kind of looked like a bit of a dog's breakfast. So we stripped out the hands and thought, okay, well, the signs will say what we need to say without having to have a hand holding it. And all the signs in the background, again, are just distracting from some of the most important stuff that's on the page, which happens to be the information that you want to read. So instead of having it vibrate behind the deck of underneath the header there, you know, we'll just go with a very simple color. It will ground the composition, and then we can still work with a pretty hefty amount of information, but in a sense that's going to be readable and digestible by whoever's reading it. And you can also see that we make changes and alterations. You know, this idea that we threw in this very famous image of the Doukhobors, of the lady who'd stripped down nude and then burned down her house, and then realized that we probably shouldn't be putting nude photos in a kids magazine. So we had to go find more appropriate content and other images, alternative images, I suppose. And then just trying to create a good sense of combination between the colors so that everything, you know, really gelled together. And I thought that this achieved quite a decent aspect of that. And then at the base, near the end of the entire process, we do try to theme our folio graphics, which is one of my favorite things. It's a little pleasure of mine every time to try and come up with something creative that pops out of the corner that reinforces the general theme of our books. And in this case, you can see for the one that was the Canadian flag, it was obviously just a Canadian flag. There's really no getting around that. But for the resistance one, we put the solidarity fist down there. And we really do try to put a fair amount of thought and effort into creating something that's going to be fun and sort of just a little, you know, just a little tidbit for people to see on the side and whatnot. Is there anything you'd like to add to this, Nancy?
No, just that sometimes it kills me to have to cut out text to make it look so much better, but it always looks so much better that it's worth it. So, no, let's move on to a little bit about how we go through the layout.
All right. All right. So here is a mock-up that I've done that gives you a sense as we go through of one of the aspects of one of our features. What will happen is we create a number of sort of landmark deadlines for us throughout the process. So once we've had our outline conversation and the bulk of the text come in, we discuss when are we going to have our preliminary draft, our comprehensive draft, and our final done. And so what happens is the preliminary I generally just call gray boxing, and we lay out, and we will put in very rough drawings, and in some cases not even drawings. We'll just block out the space that we know throughout the layout to do that. You know, so if there's going to be a headshot, we have a little gray box and then a little bit of text underneath it. In this case, this is a spread that we did explaining the difference between a Viking longboat and a Norse trading vessel called the Nar. And so what you'll see on the left is a mishmash of a very early sketch that I did with Lee while we were in my office, just saying, okay, well, how are we going to fit these two boats on the page with a front and side view and any explanation of what's going to happen? We don't have a very big magazine, so what do we do? And we thought, well, we'll do some sort of split screen. So we'll have the front of either ship coming out, and then we can show it in a smaller version of it from the front so people get a sense of what it looked like, and then there should be enough information there left over. Then what we do is we take that, we'll show that to Nancy, and we'll give her a word count, you know, maybe do some text in, which is just putting in lorem ipsum, which is kind of like just a Greek fake text that allows you to take a word count. We'll give her a word count, Nancy will write to that, and then we continue by providing that information to the illustrator. In this case, it was Brendan Hong, who's a very, very talented illustrator who works with texture just wonderfully. He creates these digital images that look very much like almost like paper cuts, when in fact it's all done inside a computer. And so he comes back and he'll do a prelim sketch as well. And from there, we can look at that and we can start to assess and make very specific changes. And this is a point at any stage throughout the magazine that I really try to stress to people. It's super important that at the rough stage, you try and make as many corrections as possible. It's very tempting to wait until the color stage, but it is much harder for an illustrator or a designer to make changes once you have laid every stroke down. This is sort of like the magic stage where you've got the structure completely put together and it's clear enough that you should be able to look at it and go, oh, well, that dragon, maybe he put a sheep's head on the top of that. And, well, it's got to be a dragon's head because that's a Viking, and that's a little bit extreme in description. But, there are subtle mistakes that sometimes illustrators will make, and often Nancy will hop in and correct that, and then we move on. Once we've caught those final mistakes, we give permission to move on to the final stage. In this case, you can see really one of the main changes that we realized is that line running down the middle diagonally was too weak, and the elements on the page were just competing with each other a little too strongly. So what we did is we created a more robust separation. So we took a nautical rope and threw that down the middle, and that created just enough separation for those two ships, which are very close to each other, to be separate enough for people to understand what they're seeing. And then the illustrator does their magic, and we end up with beautiful spreads like this. Nancy, is there anything you'd like to add?
No, this is very much your guys' area of expertise. So,
okay.
But maybe we could move on to the fiction feature because that's a little bit more where I come in.
You lead. I'm flipping over, and you lead on this one then. Oh, sure. It's fiction feature.
I'm sorry.
Let's talk about the cover because this is totally you and me.
Yeah.
All right. Well, you lead on the cover. This is great.
Great. Well, this is one that we picked specifically because we did go back and forth on it a lot. It was a 100th anniversary of the First World War, and we sort of sent some general ideas to the illustrator, and she came back with some really cool ideas, but at the top, but I was like, I think we need to see, I love that image on the upper left, but I think we need to see faces. And then the bottom ones were getting faces, and I love the little red poppies. And then we sort of ended up with that bottom right one, and James is very patient, and at the very close to the end of this process, I suddenly said, do they look too defeated? Like, we want to convey that this was a horrendous war, but do they look too almost, I don't know, just like crushed by the war, and we're giving it actually a very negative. We didn't want to get into the heroic image too far, but we also didn't want to go too far the other way. And at that point, I think my younger son was about 12. And I said, Jonah, what do you think of this cover? What do these guys look like to you? And he said, they look brave to me. It's a different kind of bravery than you usually hear about in war, but that's what it looks like to me. And I went, oh, good, nailed it. Okay. So we went through several versions, but I was very happy with the finished product.
Yeah. For the cover process for myself, this is generally what we go through. This is a lot more options than we usually get. I would say on average, sometimes, depending on the artist we're working with, sometimes we get one, and they just feel like they've got it, and they get it, and we get one option, and we're ready to go. Sometimes this is more of the professional standard. You'll get about 3 options, and sometimes you have a real go-getter like Kim Smith who did this, and she'll come in with 6. I really liked a lot of these, and all of them work very well compositionally, but what we found was we were just actually getting to know Kim in this case, and there's really an important aspect of this is developing a very strong relationship. You don't have to be the best of friends. You don't even have to have really spoken on the phone in the era that we live with, but we do have a relationship with the artists, the illustrators, and you kind of have to you don't know in the beginning whether you're going to trust their impulses, but once you work with them enough, you do it. And one of the things is Kim was really good with the environment. We told her we wanted something that was a little bit more vintage, but we still wanted it to be color, so she came up with this kind of sepia tone that went through the entire magazine, and it worked so well that we decided to even reinforce the theme further, because as most of you have probably noticed, Kayak's main logo or masthead is generally yellow. But in this case, we thought we'd pay homage to the Poppy and Remembrance Day, so we changed the main title to a red, and then reinforced it with just a small hint of color throughout the entire bit to have these little red poppies everywhere. And we actually even had to pull back on this cover because outside of the two soldiers potentially looking defeated, and from my perspective, creatively, I had been doing so much research for Canada's history as well, for the Great War, and I just had come across virtually no photos where anyone ever looked happy during the First World War. It was a very, very, very traumatic experience for most people, and so I loved that these guys had kind of a stoic look to them as they came trudging injured back over. But what we had to alter on this is that the artist had placed blood on them. So there was a blood soak through the elbow bandage of the guy with the arm and the putties, and we just had to say, and luckily in a digital era, that's all on layers, so we just said, hey, can you just take the blood off of this because it's looking a little too grotesque in this case for the people that we wanted to deal with. But yeah, it's a constant discussion all the way to the end, more so than anything. Really, we trust our artists and we say, do your thing. They do their thing. We often have very minor changes, but we can have very major changes with our cover, to the very end, regardless of how much effort we put into even in the earlier stages of trying to get things right. Yeah, that's about it. Is there anything else you'd like to add to that, Nancy?
I don't think so. Maybe in the time we have left, we can walk through some of the other specific choices we make along the way.
Absolutely. All right, so Nancy, this is yours, if you'd like to start.
Oh, sure. I'll just mention briefly. So I write the story about this. So this is a fictionalized aspect of history. It might use real people, or it might take, in this case, the idea of being a conscientious objector and turn that into a completely fictionalized story. And again, absolutely crucial to match up the right feel with the story itself. So do we want something brighter, more celebratory, a little more somber? And again, I find it absolutely fascinating to see what the illustrators do with the material I've written, and it's invaluable in creating a seamless entire piece that will have some impact for the reader.
Yeah, in this case, it's a very similar process that we do to everything. You can see in this stage we're at what we'd call a rough stage. In the gray box stage, that page on the left would be just a blank page, just a gray box. And so sometimes what we'll do is we'll mock up colors. What we try to do is create some sense of contrast between words and the page, specifically the titles. But we don't choose the color in something that's not a feature. Our features, usually we can select the themes and create a color scheme to go along with the type and everything like that. But in this case, we almost always draw a symbiotic color combination out of the artwork that the illustrator has provided. So you can see in this case, war work was pink and some kind of lime green yellow as it appears on my screen right now. And then once we'd got into the final artwork from the artist, we would just color sample and then adjust and create more vibrant colors and apply them so that the entire design of the spread, well, in this spread, this is actually a 4-page piece, is consistent and is, very enjoyable to read. In the fiction feature, we also often produce a spot illustration, and a spot illustration is just an illustration that sits generally without environment or much else. It could be very simple. In the case of this one, it's actually just the little girl lying on a rug, and that is placed within the text, pretty small, and just helps reinforce another aspect of the story as we continue on to the end. In this case, you can see that we have made alterations, and what was caught during this is that these two ladies, I believe, were supposed to be Mennonite, and the artist had come back with costume and dress from, it looks like to be about the 1941, but the hairstyles, as far as Nancy had caught, were a little too, I don't know what the word would be. Nancy, what would the word to be for the difference in the hairstyles? Maybe not conservative enough?
Yeah, the one is certainly fancier, where that wouldn't be a priority for this woman, I don't think.
Yeah, so I mean, we had to make those adjustments. You can see that the hair is tied back, and that the the shawl or the cape that looks like is on her has been removed, and she has longer sleeves, and so we make those adjustments as we go along to try and be as accurate and to the tone of the story and to the culture or people that we're trying to portray. And then we take that, and that's generally how we put the fiction feature together.
I'm just going to interrupt you quickly here, James, and let you know that we're getting very close to time. I expect our conversation to go over time, so if anybody who is listening in today does have questions, please do share them with us before you leave. That way they can be answered in the webinar, and then I would encourage you to watch the recording, skip to the end if you need to get the responses to those questions.
Okay. Well,
if you have
I can finish
registered
this.
for the webinar, you will receive a link to the recording in the next couple of days when it becomes available, so you can look out for that.
Great. Okay, well, I will just talk very quickly about maps. We use them to try and portray we have a very vast country, and what we try to do is try to get a lot of information to explain some aspect of our theme and how it touches across the country. And we'll get information from Nancy, and we will just apply a theme and try and deal with it as best as we can. In the case of the theaters one, it was about parks and open-air theaters, so we just used grass in the background, and then had little call-outs throughout the map that explained where everything was across the country. When we did the fur trade, it was a little bit more... actually, you know what, Nancy? I'll let you talk about that fur trade one, because that looks like it was a little bit more intense towards trying to figure everything out.
Yeah, just really briefly, we wanted to provide information about the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company and where their major centers were. So we did that using the different colors you see. And then I love that the illustrator then added in some of those little pictures that made the map that much more interesting. So, yeah.
And then we'll talk about our comic. The comic, again, works. We've explained our process. And it works very much like everything else. The only difference is that Nancy has to script this as opposed to writing it like your average story. So she'll come in with about 5 or 6 pages of script, and that will be presented to myself. Nancy, do you want to speak to your research process or how you put that together, or what the challenges of scripting as opposed to writing a story?
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. Obviously, you have to tell most of it through narrative, through what people are saying, with some labels, as you see here, to situate the time and the place. But try really, and again, hard for me, try to minimize the words and let the pictures tell the story. And I'd like to think that over the years I'm getting better and better at that, just letting the pictures talk. And the illustrator will come back to me sometimes and just say, can we cut this section? Or I'll say, no, but we can cut something else instead. But again, this is an incredibly research-heavy process to get again, look at that page, the teepees, the what the people are wearing, what the visual environment looks like, all those kinds of things have to be researched very heavily. What did Joey Smallwood look like as a young man? Whatever it might be. What does the countryside north of St. John look like in the 1830s? So it's a lot of fun. It's really rewarding, but man, it is so much research to get the comic somewhere close to where we want it to be.
Yeah. From my perspective, this is where you have to find the right artist and cultivate the right relationship. We found our artist, whose name is Alex the Ocean, who is just brilliant as far as I'm concerned. And I don't have to do much. I provide him with a script. Nancy will often have written the script and provided a very detailed link section at the back, which will give reference to the research that she's done as far as clothing, environment, location, historic characters, what they looked like. We do our very best to try and find the images of these people. If we can't, we will embellish if we need to. But what he then does is he reads through that entire script, and he comes out with, as you'll see on your left here, a series of very rough, what we call thumbnails. And those thumbnails will give some sense of action. In this case, this is so rough, I get a sense myself, but someone who's a writer or is unfamiliar with sequential art it may not be able to make heads or tails from what they're seeing. But it gives me this gives me comfort because I can see that the artist is already working the structure of the story out. The next thing that will come is he will send all 6 of these. This was just a screenshot that he sent with all 6 together. And then he'll send me single pages that are roughed out. And you can see that he's made space and accounted for where the text is going to go, how it interacts within the scene, how the scene flows, and it allows us to make, pretty solid changes. In this case, it can still be very difficult because the costumes aren't fully in, so we might have to make more changes later because Nancy may not catch something at this stage. But generally, we're pretty solid, and we haven't had to adjust things too much at the end. Because at the end of the day, we are paying these people, and they work pretty crazy. If anyone has any experience making comics, Alex draws, letters, inks, and paints the entire comic, and that is a colossal amount of work. So we appreciate him being on board and helping us out. But this essentially is the sequence that you'll see us go through for all 6 pages of the comic, every single issue. All right. This section, Picky is Good, is in regards to the final stages of the cover. And this is a situation where when we were doing our Titanic cover, that we'd gone all the way to the end, and there was this realization that that there was something amiss. And I'll let Nancy, this was your catch, so I'll let you talk about this one.
Yeah, and frankly, usually I should have caught these much, much earlier, but as a bit of a spot the differences, if you look at the center, which is pretty much the final art that we had from the illustrator, and I didn't notice it until the very end, and just take a second and look at the expressions on the faces of the people. And it wasn't until pretty late that I finally said, oh, you know what? It looks to me like everybody's mouth looks exactly the same. Would it be possible to quickly vary a couple of them? So you'll see, let's see if my drawing tool works. So there were this guy here. We changed his mouth, and I think the little girl, we changed her expression because once I looked at it, everybody seemed to be gaping exactly the same way. So yes, we proofread and we look for all kinds of big things, mistakes in headlines and grammar and all that stuff, but then there's the visual aspect that it's really important to check as well. So I think that was worth asking her to redo it, even though I think I A, should have caught it earlier, and B, it cost us extra, but I was happier with the final version.
Yeah, that's all right. I mean, in this case, it's one of those things where it's just a reminder that whenever you're doing an endeavor like this, when the rough stage comes in, if you are on a restricted budget, to really look at it in the rough stage, because yes, you can see that their mouths are all the same in that stage, and that's something just to keep in mind. And we always, the process of making kayak is we just absorb and move on and improve every time. That's really what we seek to do with the magazine, specifically with our production process, to allow things to move as smoothly as possible. And in the end, after all this work and all the scrutinizing and potential arguments, and I feel this way and I really strongly feel this way, what it's all about is kids enjoying this magazine and gaining further interest in Canadian history. That's really what we're trying to do, and what I feel we do very successfully, from the get-go, but that we improve on. I feel that Kayak every year is a little bit better and gaining a little bit more of a foothold and an easier time, getting kids to find our history to be as truly interesting as it actually is.
Yeah, maybe I'll just mention briefly that, not to toot our own horn too much, but we're a pretty small circulation magazine produced largely out of Manitoba, and that cover that James showed you earlier with the Prime Ministers just won the Best Illustrated Cover at the Manitoba Magazine Awards, and we also tied with our sister publication Canada's History for Magazine of the Year. So we like to think we have a little bit of an impact, but one thing that wouldn't be the same without the incredible work of our visual designers and artists and the photographic work we do, because without the visual imagery, Kayak just is not the same. So thank you all very much. Are there, Jessica, do we have time to take questions?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for listening to what we had to say. Thank you so much.
Yes, absolutely. We have some time for questions. I did want to give you both, or James, you would know, or whoever put the presentation together. Adrian had a quick question earlier about what font you used for these texts here.
Oh, that's Helvetica. Oh, excuse me. That's Helvetica New Condensed Medium.
And he'll get that in the recording because I think he stepped out. So if anybody in the audience does have any questions, you're welcome to ask them now while James and Nancy are here to answer them. And Michelle's typing, and so we'll see what she says. I do have a whole series of questions because I am a naturally inquisitive person.
Which, by the way, Jessica, I should say, is the key prerequisite to being to doing my job, I think, is just being curious and going, well, that was interesting. I wonder how that got to be that way. And then that has all kinds of implications for Kayak.
Yeah, definitely. I think, and you said you're not a historian, but that's the main part of working in history is asking those questions. Well, why? What is that? What about these people? What? All the questions you and James ask while you build this incredible publication is really the foundation of historical thinking. So Michelle has thanked you for an interesting presentation, and she is curious about audience input. And she asks, can you tell us a bit more about what input kids and parents give to the development of the magazine?
Nancy, I'll let you. Yeah.
Sure. Very little, to be blunt, Michelle. I think James and I both, and Lee too, talk to people informally. I give them to everybody I can, not to show off, just to say, and please get back to me and tell me what you like and just as maybe more importantly, what you don't like. So what we hear is really pretty anecdotal. We do have a feedback section on the website, but they're so great. Kids who like your stuff, they write and say, well, you should have 12 issues a year, and I love everything about your magazine, and which is lovely, but I'm not sure it qualifies as constructive criticism. So to answer your question, it really go ahead.
I actually find that myself, that generally when people do come to talk to me about the magazine, it's very positive. Very rarely, actually, I can't remember when someone has actually come in with true constructive criticism. Not to say it's not welcome, but what I find is as far as us being able to reach out and actually speak to anyone, especially through something like social media or online, we're actually restricted. We're not allowed to approach kids or for that information. And although we have a website, people often don't write in. I wish that they would more, to tell you the truth, because it would allow us to streamline and evolve the magazine where, to a stronger point. I'd like to, if we could find a way to engage people, it would be nice. But generally, again, they're kind of at an age that they're inaccessible to us. From at least us approaching them.
I think it is important to also mention that we recently had a large group of educators together. These are educators, past recipients, and Nancy, I don't know if you mentioned this, past recipients of the Governor General's History Award for Excellence in Teaching, many of whom use Kayak in their classrooms, with the age range, obviously, that Kayak is aimed at. And Nancy led that discussion, and there was a lot of feedback given there. And we hope to continue this kind of collaborative sessions with these educators because we know them and can trust and rely on their commentary in those areas. We can do a few more questions and then we'll wrap up. I realize that we are losing some people in the room, and that's quite all right. So feel free to keep on sending in those questions. I did want to ask Nancy, because this is a national magazine, and I mean everybody, our staff is in quite a few different places, and we all work together to create our publications. I was just wondering how, in the perspectives used in the magazine, how do you ensure the inclusion of diverse perspectives and experiences within Canadian history?
That's one of my favorite parts, to be honest, because I don't necessarily come from a trained background. It is that question of looking at something, and this is something I've learned from our history advisors, as well as I think to some extent just doing it a little bit instinctively, which is take a picture like the Fathers of Confederation, and you need to look at that picture, to my mind, and say, who's not there, right? We need to know who these men are, but who's not there? We don't have First Nations there. We don't have women there. It's a very white group. So for me, I always try to think about who do we not hear about in the traditional familiar narratives, and then how do we bring those viewpoints in? And so that's something I do work quite hard at. I sort of hope over the course of about a year that geographically we'll represent different parts of the country, different eras in our history, and that it's never going to be equal, because that would just be, that would distort our history. But that I try to represent a wide range of places, which largely comes from my personal travel, to be honest, is just the more you see of this amazing country and the more you learn about our past, the more I have these little bits and pieces filed away for future issues. But for instance, we did an issue all about the Arctic. Well, there's not going to be a lot about PEI in that one. We're doing one now, as I say, all about settlers. There's not going to be a lot about the Arctic in there. So overall, over time, I really do try to work at that. But I am also trying to be conscious of the fact that I do have a Central Canadian bias, born and raised in Ontario, and I need to just remember that my perspective on those things is not the only perspective in Canada. So just because it's what I think or what I'm familiar with, I need to work even harder at finding those other points of view from different parts of the country. So it's incredibly important. I want kids to all feel like at some point in the year they're reflected in that magazine, because we have a really diverse history, and there's certainly no one version of it.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Nancy. I think with that, we will start wrapping up as Paula and Karen, Paula is about to dash off. Thank you, Paula, for coming out to this series. Your comments and your discussion are always so valuable. Everybody should know that Paula has been to almost every webinar for the past, I want to say, 3 series. So that's like the year and a half of webinars that she has been dedicated to coming out. It's quite incredible. So thank you again, Paula. So I would like to say thank you to James and Nancy, of course, for their excellent and thorough presentation about Kayak. I definitely learned a lot about the process, the creation process today, as with everybody here, despite working within Canada's History Society. There's a lot that goes on that not everybody knows about, and for better, for worse, we all have our own roles and responsibilities. So having the opportunity to have this thorough discussion about Kayak is really incredibly valuable for myself, as well as everybody else who's here. So thank you, everybody, for tuning into today's webinar. If you didn't show up, well, I'd be talking to myself, mostly. So you definitely keep us going. This is the last webinar of the series, so it's really special, and there have been 8 webinars within this series. So if you haven't checked them out, if you didn't join us live or have already seen the recordings to those, they're all on YouTube and available for you to watch. And like I mentioned in the beginning, we've heard from all different types of people about visual history and the different places that history is being presented visually. So take a minute, even just glimpse at the types of presentations that are there to see if they're interesting to you. I am sending out a link right now in the chat box to our survey, our feedback survey. So if you have just 3 to 5 minutes, just give us a bit of information about how you enjoyed today's presentation. If anything in this presentation will be useful for you in the work that you do, and a few other questions there. Very simple. So thanks everybody again. If you're like me and if you haven't had lunch, I'm sure you're starving, because I know I am. So let's share a meal together across the country, but separately, but knowing that we're eating at the same time. All right, I'm done. Thanks again, Nancy and James. Let us feast. Very good. While we are filling out our feedback surveys, of course. Excellent.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.